Let's get this sports podcast party started, all right?
The JAYREELZ podcast.
What is happening, my good people? Greetings. How are you? How's it going? How's everybody doing out there? What is the latest and greatest? Hope everybody's doing well, feeling fantastic, in excellent spirits, feeling a little bit green in these parts as St. Paddy's Day 2025 has arrived, but so is the latest podcast as we get set to break out from the Sports Dead Zone Part 1 over the past 5 weeks as this is the JAYREELZ podcast with your host, JAYREELZ. For my first timers, welcome aboard. And for those who've been banging with me going back to the very beginning, somewhere in the middle, even as early as this past Thursday, I welcome you guys and gals back. And yes, we could finally unlift the, I don't want to go as far as saying stench, because we've had some things percolating here over the last couple of weeks in the world of sports, but we could start to see the sun over the horizon. We could start to look forward to not only an NCAA tournament, which will begin tomorrow night, and that's where I'm going to start, but we also have baseball, which is also going to begin tomorrow. But in essence, 10 days from today, the baseball season begins, and all the other sports that surround the landscape, which you know I'm going to unpack. But I have to start off with the tournament. We do have the final 68. We do have the first four. I understand we have to include them because they're going to be a huge part of what could possibly take place here as we get set to go all in, especially Thursday and Friday, as I've been talking about for the last few weeks. But there is some controversy that surrounds this first four. And I talked about this team on Thursday, went in on the North Carolina Tar Heels as a team that was on the bubble, but quite possibly they could get into the final 68 from the perspective of them having a decent run in the ACC tournament, which we all know they lost there to Duke in the quarterfinal. And even though Cooper Flagg, who was not in, and the likelihood of him playing in the tournament, I believe come Friday, is going to be high. He did suffer that ankle sprain against Georgia Tech, where he did not play, obviously, the rest of the tournament, including the game on Thursday. Oh, let me make sure I got that right. Yes, including the game on Thursday, where Carolina, they were a lane violation away from possibly pushing the game into overtime. But that was not the case as they lost in regulation 74-71. But be that as it may, for whatever the reason, the selection committee, which also includes a guy named Bubba Cunningham, who was the AD at North Carolina, who had to leave the room because he could not be a part of which team was going to be selected. But you have to wonder, deep down inside, was Bubba Cunningham just maybe a little whisper or two away from saying, hey, I understand it may be a slim chance, but can we somehow, some way get the Carolina Blue into the tournament, even if that means they're just part of the first four? Now, I understand that comes across as a little conspiracy theorist, but who knows? Because when we break down North Carolina, I'm sorry, when you only have one win against a team that is in the tournament as they are in UCLA, but they have just a laundry list of other teams that they lost to along the way. Whether that be Clemson, whether that be Duke 3 times, even without a one Cooper Flagg, whether it's Michigan State, whether it's Louisville, whether it's Clemson, whether it's Kansas. I mean, shall I continue? And for them to be, I believe it was 1-13 against those teams, quad 1 or 2. And for them to not go deep into the ACC tournament. Obviously, if they would have won the tournament, they would have been right off the bat in, who knows, probably as a lower seed, but still, they would have clinched and it would have not had to worry about whether or not they would be on the bubble. But as it was, considering that they have, I get it, a strong schedule, and I don't want to hear about the conference either because the ACC is not like the ACC of yesteryear. I understand Duke is there, and now, of course, you got to throw in Carolina, but this isn't a stacked ACC where you came out with 5 or 6 teams. I believe only 3 teams came out of the ACC this year, and for that, you can look at whether it was just a conference overall. And yes, I understand the schedule was tough, but you had to win more than just one game against UCLA. And we understand this isn't UCLA of yesteryear either. This isn't the John Wooden, Kareem. Now, I understand I'm going back 50, 55 years, but still, UCLA is not a powerhouse here in this tournament. And when you look at the likes of other teams that could have gone in, whether that be West Virginia, who had beaten Kansas, who had beaten Iowa State, and was without their best player all year, pretty much, who hurt himself, I believe, in December. And for West Virginia, the Mountaineers, they certainly have an argument here. or even another team like Boise State. We talked about Indiana a little bit there on Thursday, even Ohio State for that matter, where the first two teams, Indiana and I believe Ohio State, they both had 9 wins against quad 1 or quad 2 teams. And for Texas to get in, now mind you, it's the first 4, but for Texas to get in, and Texas was 6-12 in their conference, on top of them losing 15 games. How many teams get into the tournament with 15 losses? And understand they're not in the bulk of the tournament. They have to get in the tournament by winning their first game here before they advance to be a part of the final 64. But that's a disgrace. And yes, they may have 7 quad 1 wins. But when Indiana, as well as Boise, as a matter of fact, I take that back. Indiana and Ohio State have 9 quad 1 wins, and Boise has 8. And then you have Texas with 7, on top of them losing 15 and 6-12 in their own conference. That right off the bat, they shouldn't have been involved and should not have been selected by the committee here. So I'm sure those schools are just up in arms and they got to be sick to their stomachs. And to me, that's why I had to jump off here before I even go through the brackets and before I even get to some of these storylines here. But for Carolina, who I figured that maybe if they got to a semifinal and beaten Duke, I get it without Cooper Flagg, but that's not their fault. And knowing that they would have had a long road just to even get to a semifinal, and if they would have won the whole thing, and as it was, just having them get to a quarterfinal and lose, albeit in a close game, you had to figure that they were going to be on the outside looking in, and here they are, part of the tournament, and I'll get to the games there tomorrow night, where they're going to be the 9:40 game, TruTv, as we all know, the double dip, not only tomorrow, but also Wednesday as we get closer to, in essence, the start of the NCAA tournament. And then you also have another thing where the committee, and I think college basketball on a whole, they have to scrap the Sunday games. Because the teams that won yesterday, whether it was Yale or whether it was Michigan, now their turnover, they have to begin play on Thursday. So for them to have to play their conference championships on Sunday and then have to transition where they pretty much only have a couple of days before they fly out to the city that they're going to be playing in on a Thursday. And I got to check when Michigan is playing that game. And let me see. As a matter of fact, I pull it up right here. All right, it's a night game, but still, where they're playing UC San Diego. It's not as if that once you get to Selection Sunday, that should be it. All the college basketball games should be in the books. The last game, even if it goes past midnight on Saturday night into Sunday. Bottom line is that the college basketball powers that be, they have to change this to where all the games have been played by the time you wake up Sunday morning. So all they have to do is prepare and get all their seedings and get all the brackets set up to where you have the Selection Sunday show, 6 o'clock on CBS, raring to go. Not where you have a team that just finished playing their game and maybe cutting down the nets in their particular conference, and therefore 5 minutes later you have the Selection Sunday show to where, all right, well, Michigan, they're going to be penciled in as a 5 seed, but they're going to have to play Thursday, considering that they're only going to have a day or two to rest, regroup, and then fly out to that city and then get the tournament started. To me, that is not fair. They have to switch that. They have to change that. And hopefully they do that as early as next year. And as we know, the tournament, they're thinking to expand maybe as early as 2026 to where you have 78 teams. Seriously? Can we just put the kibosh on that? And we understand it's money, and we understand it's contracts with the cable networks, in particular TNT, TBS, TruTv, etc. Because it's not as if the game is on CBS as it once was as early as, I believe, just 3-4 years ago. Now it's a situation where the game is on, I think it's on TNT or TBS, one of those two networks, where the Final Four and the championship game is exclusively on those networks. So we don't even get a chance to watch it on free TV. Granted, if you have cable, I understand. But still, this is the lay of the land here, not only just in college basketball, but in all the sports. And I'm sure in the coming years, if Amazon Prime or if any of these other streaming services, they're going to try to gobble up the tournament, knowing that this is a gold mine, even if it's just for 3 weeks, but knowing that if they could just have their games on their platforms to then have it streamed for billions of dollars, of course, the NCAA, they're going to take the highest bidder and they're going to go with that. So even if the Cooking Channel comes out with a streaming service and says, you know what, we're going to fork over $100 billion for the next 10 years, guess what? The NCAA, they're going to take that and run to the bank and laugh all the way to the bank in the process. So hopefully they change that up as far as the games being played there on Saturday and no games on Sunday. And then on top of that, yes, you're going to have to watch these games on cable. And I understand that everybody has cable, or for those who are streaming, YouTube TV and some of the other platforms that are out there. But yes, the days of watching Jim Nance with Billy Packer there on CBS, starting at 5:40 on Saturday, going into Monday a little bit after 9 for the championship game, they are long gone. And before you know it, they're going to be streamed somewhere, and you can even forget about watching it on TNT or TBS. So I just had to get that off of my chest as we move it along. Now, as far as the other things that go with the brackets, and I will say this, I'm not going to break down every game. I'll break down the brackets overall, just as a storyline standpoint. But come Thursday's podcast, which of course that's when in earnest the tournament will begin, I'll have my breakdowns. I'll give you my final four. I figured I'd break it up considering that Thursday I'm going to record before the first tip-off there shortly after high noon there on Thursday. So I'm not going to give you any of that today. I will go through the brackets as far as which are the toughest, which are the easiest, who has a cakewalk, etc. But overall, I won't get into the nuts and bolts and sink our teeth into all these brackets and who do I think is going to come out of each region there, which I'll save for Thursday. So right there, you've been warned. Now, as far as the other controversy that's surrounding the selection, and now these are teams that are already in, how could Michigan, who beat Wisconsin there, not only twice, but also yesterday in the conference tournament there in the Big Ten, how is it that Michigan is seeded as 5 and Wisconsin is a 3 seed? Now, let me make it sense here. I mean, I don't see how the committee is going to break it down. Why? Because maybe Wisconsin has a bigger win than Michigan does throughout the course of the year? And that's the same also for Clemson. Because Clemson, who lost to Louisville, now let me double check that as I'm looking here. Right, Louisville actually has let me flip-flop that. Louisville, who went to the ACC final and lost to Duke. And when you think about it, how is it that Clemson has a higher seed than Louisville, who went deeper into the tournament and actually beat Clemson throughout the year? So I don't understand how the committee is looking at it from a seeding perspective to where you have one team who beat another, but therefore the team that lost has the higher seed. To me, that doesn't make any sense. And when I take a look at it here, and I want to make sure I got my facts correct. Yeah, you had Wisconsin the higher seed and Clemson, where Louisville beat them twice, including the semis at the ACC, and then to think that they're an 8, but Clemson's a 5. I don't understand that. So you have to, for me, make it make sense, and the committee certainly has some explaining to do, although they're going to look at it as like, well, this team beat that team, or even at least Clemson beat Duke along the way, where Louisville did not beat Duke in the regular season. So if they're going to use that as the barometer, all right, I guess, but how is it that Louisville beats Clemson, but they get the lower seed? So, and not only that, but they have an 8-9 matchup against Creighton. So what's going to happen there? They're going to be possibly the sacrificial lamb to Auburn there in the South. So if you're Louisville, I'm sure you're highly upset knowing that you didn't get a better seed. And then on top of that, you're going to have to play the number 1 overall, I might add, against Auburn in the South, where Auburn, although did not get to the conference final, but they still have the number 1 seed overall in the country, considering their consistency throughout the year. But those are just some big-time discrepancies there, starting off with North Carolina, as you know, even Texas not getting, or them getting a bid and not having the Indianas or Ohio States or the Boise's or even West Virginia. And like I mentioned, West Virginia, they beat Kansas, they beat Iowa State, and they also beat Gonzaga and Arizona. Granted, it was early on at the Maui Invitational there in late November into December, but still, that accounts for something, doesn't it? And I understand they had their best player playing at the time, Tucker DeVries, where he had hurt himself there in the early part of December and did not play for the rest of the year. But considering that he's been out since the early part of the schedule, where West Virginia ended up beating Kansas and Iowa State, who at the time was number 2 overall in the country. And therefore, they don't get a bid, but North Carolina does. I understand every year you're going to have controversy, and every year you're going to have scenarios where teams are going to get snubbed, or teams are going to be left out, or teams are going to get screwed by getting a terrible seed. But this just goes to show, and I understand it's never going to be perfect. You're always going to have something to lash out about when it comes to why this team was seated here or how come you left this team out, etc. But to me, this was just egregious. And this is coming from somebody who, over the last couple of weeks, has really gotten into the college basketball. And listen, I have to. This is part of my job. But at the same time, I can't front. And as always, being authentic and transparent with the audience out there, I'm pretty much parachuting in, because it's not as if from the time dating back to the Maui Invitational in the middle of an NFL season that I'm following college basketball on a day in, day out basis. Absolutely not. But I've had to brush up, do my homework here to make sure that what I'm going to put forth is not only going to be informative, but certainly credible. And obviously for you guys and gals to get an understanding of where we're at here in college basketball as we get ready to start this tournament. I'm just not going to come out here and be like, oh, well, here are your 1 seeds, here's this bracket, here's this. Oh, yeah, this team got snubbed, and all right, now let's move on to the NBA. No, I got to give you a little bit more than that, and hopefully I'm doing so up until this point. But I tell you, this was one that certainly blew the mind when I took a look at the brackets and I said, wait a second, how did North Carolina get in? And then I'm starting to put the puzzle together, and I'm saying, wait a minute, how are these other teams on the outside when they have a lot more credibility than North Carolina ever had this year? And I get it. It's the name brand, it's the blue blood, it's North Carolina. Well, the only way that they will have shown the selection committee any respect is that if they win this game tomorrow night, and not that this game is, I'm sure a lot of people are going to watch just to make sure they do advance, and TruTv will have a pretty decent rating. But for them to go up against San Diego State, and they know their way around the tournament, as you know, getting to a final a couple of years ago. But for the Tar Heels, if they're going to really have the strength of the selection committee, they have to at least not only win this game here tomorrow night, but maybe even win the next game and get to a Sweet 16 in order for the selection committee to pat themselves on the back to look smart. So we'll have to wait and see, and who knows, by Thursday, we'll find out whether or not Carolina's in the tournament, as I'll reconnect with you guys and gals at that time. But besides that, we know about Auburn, we know about Florida, Houston, and Duke. Those are your 1 seeds going into the tournament. And now as we get into it, before we get to the first four and kind of break that down, based on what I see here throughout these regions, and just to give you an overview, by far, how I look at it, the gauntlet, if you want to call it that, is the West. And I understand St. John's, for them winning their first Big East tournament since 2000, and congratulations to Rick Pitino and company, and I'm sure they're going to be a tough out when we get to the beginning of this craziness that's going to start here on Thursday. But I have to say, as I look at the brackets here to the big screen, for those watching on YouTube or even Spotify to the right of me, the West is certainly going to be a challenge, because you have Florida as the 1 seed, and they're going to be formidable to say the least. Florida, who has physicality and they could score, and they look like that they're going to be one team that could possibly get to San Antonio for a Final Four. But you also have St. John's as a 2 seed there. The other teams that are also coming out. Now, it's interesting because you have UConn, the two-time defending champ. They're going to play Oklahoma in their first round. They're on Friday, but to think, once they beat what you think, I can't say they're going to beat them, but if they go ahead and beat the Sooners, and if Florida does what we expect them to do and beat Norfolk State, you're going to have a clash of the last 2 back-to-back national champions in the sport. The 06-07 Florida Gators, and then obviously, just like I mentioned, the last 2 years where UConn has won the title. Now, I understand UConn is not the same team that we've seen here over the last 2 years, but it certainly is going to be a juicy matchup to see what's going to happen with those 2 schools. But with Florida, obviously with St. John's there, Maryland, who's played very well this year, Missouri's a team that could score, and they're a 6 seed going up against Drake. You also have Texas Tech as another team that certainly is a team that could surprise people. To me, that is the one region that I think is the toughest. The second toughest is the South. And the South, as we just talked about with Auburn, you also have Michigan State. We know what Tom Izzo has done, although not really of recent vintage. And although we talked about Michigan State, the 25th anniversary of their last title there with Mateen Cleaves, so you know there's going to be a little nostalgia around Izzo, the Spartans, etc. But then you also have Iowa State, who's had a big-time year. Texas A&M, the same. Michigan, if you want to also include them. But with that region in the South, I look at that as the second toughest next to the West. And then the East and the Midwest, not so much. Now, what's fascinating is in the Midwest, you have Houston and Tennessee, who are your 1 and 2 seeds, and you could actually have them play in a regional final, which could be college basketball set back 50 years from now, because you could have a 52-49 final when it's all said and done. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, just a little food for thought there. But when we look at both of those regions, you do have teams like Tennessee, like I mentioned, and I'm talking about the Midwest here. Kentucky, who, of course, they're Kentucky. Is it a vintage Kentucky team? It is not, but still. Then you also have Clemson coming out of there. The Fighting Illini, who are very hot and cold. They could blow teams out by 20, but then also look at their scores this year with their opponents. They could also lose by 20. So who knows what Illinois team you're going to get, even as a 6th seed. You have Purdue there. All right, obviously it's not Purdue these last couple of years with Zach Edey, but still. But to me, I look at that region, and there isn't really a team that's going to stand out. You do have Gonzaga there. I understand for those who are going to be looking at Gonzaga and Mark Few and what he's done here. Now, granted, he hasn't won a title, but at least he's gone to a championship, as you saw there just a few years ago. But for this particular region, it's one that's like, eh. And then the same has to be said for the East. Because Duke, a lot of people thought St. John's was going to be a part of that region, and now they're going to be, as you know, they're going to be out west. But you have Duke, Alabama. We understand that they could score, and they could certainly give Duke a run for their money. You have Arizona. Okay, Arizona, let's see what they could do here, as they have not been able to flourish in the tournament here over the last half decade plus. Oregon is another team that knows their way around, but they're a 5th seed, and who knows if they're going to have any length in this tournament. You also have Wisconsin, as we talked about there, where they probably should have had a lower seed, but with them losing in the championship game to Michigan yesterday, they still have a 3 seed. But how good are they going to be? BYU could be a dangerous team, as they could also score with anybody here in the country as a 6th seed. But I really look at this region as one that's not really formidable, not one that Duke, if Cooper Flagg is going to be healthy, that they could be able to come out of this region. Now, Duke, this isn't a team that automatically is going to be a Final Four team. Look at all the teams that they've had here over the last X amount of years. Even the one year where they had Zion, Cam Reddish, and RJ Barrett. What did that team do? That team, I don't even think they made it to a regional final. So just because Cooper Flagg is there, and even though he may not be 100%, as we all know, probably 50% of him is better than close to 100% than a lot of the players in the nation, but still, this isn't a vintage Duke team that I could rally around and say, oh yeah, they're going to have the goods. Now, that's not to say they're going to be an easy out here, but that region is one that certainly isn't going to be a all-world or world-beating type of region to where Duke is really going to have to sweat it out as a 1 seed. I'm sorry. Listen, I understand Alabama's very good, and I get it that Wisconsin also had a very good season as well. And yes, you have maybe those dark horses there when you're looking at Arizona, maybe even BYU. I'm looking at BYU as a team that could possibly make some hay, because you can't pick all 1 seeds. You can't pick all 2 seeds here if you're going to try to fill out your brackets. And there's a lot of formidable 1 and 2 seeds that we could go through as well. I may save that for the podcast on Thursday. But again, West, I'm not going to say it looks stacked, but in comparison to the other regions, to me, that's the hardest bracket. Followed by the South, and if you want to rank it, I'll say the Midwest and then the East, because does Duke have a cakewalk? I hate to say it, they're playing in the East. We know that the Duke fan base, their faculty, etc., students, they're going to flock there as it is, as we know, but they're going to travel, and they're going to play their games in Newark when it comes to the Sweet 16 and when you get to a regional final. So they pretty much have it tailor-made for them to get to a Final Four. Now, I look at that as the easiest. Maybe you could fight me off and think of the Midwest, because Houston, as good as they are, and even with Tennessee, but look at the other teams. Kentucky, that's not a real Kentucky team. Let's look at a team like Purdue. We understand Purdue, granted that they did make it to a final last year, but they're not the same type of team last year or overall in the tournament. They certainly do not seal the deal or win the big game when they absolutely have to. Illinois, can I trust them 100%? I get it. And there's another team that I actually forgot out west. And I understand they're playing against one another, and even though they've fallen flat, if you ask me, it's Kansas, but also Arkansas. And they're part of the West bracket where, again, not to say that they're going to make a tremendous run, but we've seen Cinderella teams, especially those that have double-digit seedings. Could Arkansas make a run there in the West to go along? And they're going to play against Kansas in that first game there, on Thursday night. So that's why the West, to me, is the strongest out of all the brackets, or all the regions, excuse me. But as we see here, whether it's the West being the toughest, followed by the South, Midwest, and East, I will certainly unpack it all come Thursday with my Final Four picks, the team that I think that could possibly make some hay in any of those regions as far as a sleeper team. And yes, you're not going to get all 1 seeds or 1 and 2 seeds when it comes to filling out my bracket. That's not going to happen here. So if you're looking for me to come out and say, oh, it's going to be Florida, Auburn, Duke, and then let me see, I'll throw in a 2 seed there. And St. John's? No. Oh, excuse me. St. John's is in their bracket. My apologies. Or Michigan State? That's not going to happen. If you want to get chalk, watch a lot of these shows or listen to a lot of those podcasts. And this coming from someone that hasn't followed from the start of the season. Yes, again, over the last couple of weeks, but I would say I have a pretty decent feel for the teams that have come in hot or for the teams that I think they could go on a big run. And you'll get my Final Four and all the predictions there on Thursday's podcast. So you definitely do not want to miss that. And then lastly, the SEC, which we talked about there on Thursday, we thought maybe 13 bids. They got 14 bids. To think, they got in essence, they got more than 20%. I was going to say 25%. They got 20% of the field there coming out of that conference. And then you have 8 bids from the Big Ten and 7 from the Big 12. So right off the bat, that's 29 bids. So you have almost half the field there from just those 3 conferences. So that's something to keep in mind as we move it along here. All right, and then your first 4, let's get into that real quick. Now, of course, the first game there is Alabama State and St. Francis. I couldn't even tell you who the coaches are, who the players are. Obviously, they're fighting out for the 16th seed, and they're going to be the sacrificial lambs to Auburn for starters. So let's see what's going to happen there. San Diego State and UNC. Listen, San Diego State knows their way around here, and I understand the players have changed here over the last couple of years. 100% get it. But can I predict who's going to win this game? Now, they'll play Ole Miss, the winner of this game. Now, to me, it's either way. North Carolina's going to win, and it's going to make the selection committee, at least for one night, look good. Or San Diego State's going to win, and then the selection committee is going to look like a bunch of fools. Just to be a contrarian, I'll pick San Diego State. Now, I'm just basing that on their recent track record. And even though UNC went to a final in 2022, just 3 years ago, against the Kansas Jayhawks, but I'll say, just to throw a wrench in the mix, I'll say San Diego State. Then you have American, one of the teams that North Carolina beat throughout the year, but because they're part of the first 4, I can't give them a ton of credit. They're going to play St. Mary's or Mount St. Mary's, and the winner will play Duke. And then you have Texas, who we talked about, play Xavier. Now, I'm going to say Xavier only because a little bit more close to home. Texas, I get it that they're a team that's always in the tournament, but they are another one that's always snake bit. They never seem to get over the hump. So to be the contrarian, I'm going to pick Xavier to win that game. And the winner of that game, which they'll play Wednesday night, will face the Fighting Illini. And Illini, I just talked about them as a 6th seed and how they are hot and cold from one game to the next. So that is your overall feel here as we get closer to tomorrow night, obviously Wednesday, and when the tournament begins there on Thursday, I'll have it all ready for you with a nice big ribbon on top as we get set for the madness to begin here in the next day or so. All right, now I'm going to stick with basketball, but I'll go to the pros here. Now, there is quite a bit to get into. First thing being that the Cleveland Cavaliers finally lost 16 games in a row. And they lost yesterday to the Magic, where they couldn't hit a basket there in the final minute or so. Donovan Mitchell missing a ton of shots. Paolo Banchero delivering, coming through. And that was a game that was thrusted into the ABC 1 o'clock window because that was originally Philadelphia at Dallas. But because of both of their teams being decimated by injuries And not being a marquee game, they gave it to Orlando, Cleveland, considering what the Cavaliers have done this year. And Orlando, I get it. They're one of those middling teams there in the East that are trying to fight out for position there between the 7 and 10 range when it comes to the play-in scenario. But when you have the Magic in Cleveland beat them, that's a bit of a story. Now, who knows? They ran out of gas down the stretch. I know Orlando's a team, like I said, fighting it, especially trying to get the 7 seed over the Hawks, considering that whomever has that 7 seed will have the home court advantage for not just one, but both games if they happen to lose the 7-8 matchup. So we'll keep in mind of that as we get deeper into the month, and then obviously into April, where the season will conclude now less than a month from now. But for Cleveland, they're perfectly fine. We know the position that they're in. And if you did listen to the podcast on Thursday, I advise you to go back to that, because I was talking about Cleveland and Oklahoma City, which they're only separated by a half game. Cleveland 56-11, OKC 56-12, as two teams that are going to have bullseye squarely on their backs to have deep, long postseason runs. And I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're the most optimistic Thunder or Cleveland Cavalier fan. I don't care if you're the biggest NBA fan going. I don't care if you're a bandwagon of these teams. And if they don't come out of their conference, or they lose in 6 games to whether it be the Celtics if you're the Cavaliers, or the Nuggets, Lakers, whomever that may be out west, I don't want to hear that, well, we had a great year, we went to the conference final, oh, we took a step closer. Like I said then, and I'll say now, if you've had big-time regular seasons where these teams are going to win easily, anywhere between 66 to 68 games, they have to get to an NBA final. I'm sorry, that's just no way, shape, if, ands, buts, babies about it. I don't care who you are. They have to get to an NBA final. So I'll just leave it there, and I'm probably going to regurgitate that here over the course of the next few weeks leading up to the playoffs. But you have that going on with the NBA. That's one thing that we can kind of scratch out. The few other things that I have is Steph Curry making 4,000 three-pointers, and I understand a remarkable achievement. But considering he's number one, does it really matter at this point? Let's just get to the end of his career, and let's see where he lands when it comes to the three-point and how many that he's made throughout the course of his career. And I understand that is a nice milestone. It's just 4,000. It's even. Now everybody's thinking, could he get to 5,000? And who knows? He's 36 years of age. He could probably play for another 3-4 years if he averages 250 a year for the next 4 years. And you would think he's going to slow down at some point. But because he hits 1 million threes, 5,000 isn't out of the realm of possibility unless he has those ankles, which have bothered him at times throughout the course of his career. They start acting up, and Father Time says, you're not going to get to 5,000. Then chances are he's not going to make it. But 4,000, I get it. Congratulations. I don't want to diminish it. I don't want to look at that as, that's no big deal. Because it is. The guy's the greatest shooter ever lived, and probably will be the greatest shooter that's ever lived when it's all said and done. 10, 15, 20, who knows, 50 years down the road. I won't be here in 50 years, knock on wood, God willing. But still, that'll be 106 at that time. But with that being said, 4,000, let's just wait till he gets to 5,000. To me, that's even a bigger and better number as opposed to 4. But I get it. Before you get to 5, you got to get to 4. I understand. I'm kind of throwing cold water on it. But congrats to Steph Curry on that achievement. Then you have Jalen Brunson. Who knows what's going to happen with him when it comes to that ankle. He's going to be out for another week. And mind you, it's already been, 9 days since he tweaked his ankle there when he hurt it at Golden State. And was it at Golden State? No, they played Golden State just 2 nights ago. That was the game 10 days ago in LA. That was a Thursday night game where he hurt it then. And it said 1 to 2 weeks at that time. And it's already been a week and a half. So now it's going to be another week that he's on the shelf. And for him, maybe even 2 weeks. So it could be 3.5 weeks when it's all said and done. If you're the Knicks, you got to get this guy rested as quick as possible. Now, in the conference, they have a cushion. They're going to be the 3 seed. Even without Brunson in the lineup, they're currently 5 games. Let me make sure I got that right. 5 games ahead of the Bucks in the Eastern Conference. So you know what? There's no rush to bring him back. Let him sit there. Let him rest up to be close to 100%, if not 100%, once you get to the latter part of April, and then it's all systems go. So you have that to deal with if you're a Knicks fan. Then you have the Aaron Fox. And I hate to throw this out here to the Spurs fan, the 15 of you outside of San Antonio. The Aaron Fox had to get surgery on a pinky So they had to shut him down for the rest of the year. And we know Victor Wembanyama is shut down for the rest of the year, which sadly brought back visions of the 1996-97 season. And why do I bring that up at this point? Remember, that was the year that David Robinson sat out a bunch of games. That was the year that Sean Elliott sat out a bunch of games. That was the year, you could go through the whole roster, where they sat out a ton of games, the Spurs, to tank it in hopes of getting the number 1 pick overall. And of course, that was the year with the Boston Celtics. Look it up. And for those who maybe want to question my Celtic fandom, they were 15-67 that year. That's right. 15-67. I went to 3 games that year. And in those 3 games, they won 2 of those. Look them up. In Boston, I believe the date was January 31st, where they were down double digits. I believe they were down by 20 points to the Trailblazers, where they came all the way back to 1 and won that game. And then I went to Philadelphia. I believe the date was April 18th. Look that up, or maybe 15th. But the 18th, it was the last weekend of the NBA regular season on a Friday night where they won in Philadelphia. 15 wins. And I was hoping that they would get the big prize coming out of Wake Forest and a 1 Tim Duncan. And as we all know, how the lottery, the ping pong balls and where they fell and how it all unfolded, it went to San Antonio. And for whatever the reason, why do I have this gut feeling, knowing that there's a guy waiting in the wings that plays at Duke, who we would think is going to be the consensus number 1 overall pick? Could you even fathom, could you even imagine to have De'Aaron Fox, Victor Wembanyama, and Cooper Flagg on the same team? Why do I have a feeling that the basketball gods somewhere in the heavens above are just shaking their hands like I'm doing now here on the camera to think that when Greg Popovich, fully healthy, next year, to come back to the coaching sidelines there in San Antonio and beyond, for him to have those 3 players and for him to be set to go on a run with that threesome, similar to Duncan, Tony Parker, and Manu Ginobili when they won all those titles there in the latter part of 1999, and then, of course, the 2000s from 03, 05, 07, and 2014. Somehow, some way, I can see that happening. We'll have to wait for the lottery to find out. And then you have some sad news. One of the great names, great nicknames in NBA history of all time. Donald Earl Watts, otherwise known as Slick Watts, especially in the Pacific Northwest, there with the Seattle Supersonics. Led the league in steals and assists in 1976 and always rocked that headband. One of the first guys to rock a headband in the NBA, and especially the way he did the green and yellow colors. How can you forget those colors there of the Sonics back then? Passed away at the age of 73 over the weekend. And here's a guy that had a good NBA career, not a Hall of Famer by any stretch, but certainly made his name there in Seattle, had a stroke there in 2021, and his health had not really recovered ever since. And for him to pass away there, 73, just terrible news. Thoughts, prayers, condolences go out to the NBA, the Seattle metropolitan area, all of the state of Washington, etc., for one Slick Watts as he transitions there at 73. And as far as the league overall, what more can I tell you? Now, I know the West has gotten a little bit interesting there. Even though the Lakers did win, they snapped their losing streak there when they had that East Coast trip where they lost to the Celtics, and then they lost in Brooklyn, and then they came home after losing to Milwaukee and Denver for the Lakers to get back on the beam, which they did by beating the Suns there yesterday. And for the Lakers, who, although have a couple of games in hand to the teams that are ahead of them, but that is a foursome, I should have completed that, where it's going to go right down to the wire. You have Houston, Denver, Memphis, all at 43-25, where the Rockets have now won 6 in a row. And then you have the Lakers at 41-25. So instead of a couple of games, they have one game in hand to those aforementioned 3 teams. So you know that is going to come down to the wire, at least so we think here, over the last few weeks of the season. Golden State has been red hot. They've won 7 in a row. And now, although in the 6th seed, away from the playing scenario, but you have Minnesota who have been nipping on their heels. So considering that they've won 7 in a row, the T-Wolves, who have made 0 ground, but they've won 8 in a row. And granted that they have one more win than Golden State, but the Warriors have 2 games in hand. So you have to take that in consideration as the season moves along, where Golden State, not to say they're in the driver's seat, but with those 2 games in hand, they could certainly catapult themselves or at least stay in the 6th seed, where Minnesota, although on a torrid stretch, have been unable to get into the bulk or at least the top 6 of the Western Conference, because obviously you avoid the playing scenario altogether. But even though if Minnesota, the season ended today, at least they have the luxury of hosting the first playing game. And if they lose that game, just like I mentioned with the East, with Atlanta, if they lose that first game, at least they have the safety net of having another home game in their building against the 9th and 10th seed victor. So the West is going to be wild, unlike the East, as you know. And even with the Suns losing and the Mavericks sputtering, as you know, I mean, they've just been awful, and understandably so with all the injuries that they've had to deal with here over the last month and change. But for Phoenix, who still a game behind and a game and a half in the standings, I don't know if they're going to have what it takes. And even though they have a window that's cracked that they could actually open and barrel right through, they certainly haven't done that. And just like I said a few weeks ago, prior to the Kyrie injury, I didn't think they were going to do so. Well, this is just early indication that they have not taken it seriously, that they've not looked to think that Dallas has been a wounded animal here at this point. And the Suns, although they want to peak in the horizon and start to rise, but for whatever the reason, they just start to rise and then they set, then they start to rise and they set. Well, who knows? Will they continue to set to the point where their playoff chances are going to be dark? I think that's going to be the case. That's not going out on a limb, but considering that the Mavericks have done anything and everything to say, you know what, we don't want the 10th seed, go ahead and take it, the Suns have not done so. And then in the East, like I mentioned, I know you have Bucks, Pacers, Pistons in the middle, separated by a game and a half, but you really have no race. Am I going to get into that 7 through 10 seed? Now, the Heat have lost 7 in a row. 29-38, you're going to have a situation where whomever's going to come out of that 9-10 game, they could be anywhere between 9 to 12, even 13 games on the 500, and they're going to end up facing either Atlanta or Orlando in the process. The East is just a mess. Granted that the top 6 are good, but after that, it is a nightmare. And as we take a look at the schedule here over the next few days, here in the association, you have the Heat playing the Knicks tonight, as the Knicks come back from that long road trip. Philadelphia at Houston, only because Houston and where they're at. Indiana at Minnesota, good game there. Denver at Golden State. And Miami, New York, Denver, Golden State is an ESPN double dip. You're going to see a lot of Monday, Tuesday games. In this case, tonight, ESPN, because you have the playing scenarios for the college basketball, so that's going to take precedence, although they're on TruTv. I could see if they're on a major network, but not the case. Then you have tomorrow night, Milwaukee at Golden State, Brooklyn at Boston. Both of those games are on NBA TV. Cleveland playing the Clippers. Good game there. Then Wednesday, ESPN double dip is Detroit at Miami, Denver at LA to play the Lakers. Then you have Houston at Orlando, Cleveland at Sacramento. I know Sacramento's in that 7 to 10 range. They're actually 9th right now. Not all the good games here. And let me just look at Thursday, although we'll be back on the air. Thursday, no, you don't have a lot. Well, Milwaukee's playing the Lakers. Little rematch from the game there on Thursday. That's what you have there in the association. Now as I take off the high tops and put on the skates to go through the National Hockey League, and there's not really much to unpack here either. I'm sorry. I may just jump right to the standings and the schedule, because what am I going to do? Am I going to get into Mikko Rantanen, who, remember, got traded from from Colorado to Carolina in January, and then Carolina flipped him to Dallas for a bunch of picks, and then Dallas went to Colorado yesterday, where Colorado beat Dallas in overtime, and even though Mikko Rantanen went out with his former teammates for dinner there on Saturday night and reconnected with them, obviously with a guy that was, I believe, selected 10th overall in 2015 and had been on the Avalanche for 9+ years. Of course, he's made good friends and had some very good relationships with his former teammates. So, of course, him coming into town and having a bit of a party and reconvening there for the first time in a while, And I understand that's going to happen there with former teammates, but for the Stars to lose and Colorado has played pretty well, and Colorado looking to even maybe have a rematch there with Dallas, and I'll get to that in a minute. But other than talking about that, and Alex Ovechkin, who is now 8 goals away from Wayne Gretzky, surpassing him on the top of Mount Gretzky all-time goal-scoring list in NHL history. And with how many games left to go, I believe what, they got like 14 to go, tops. 15 to go with 8 goals needed. You would think he's going to get that. Now, I think in order for him to be comfortable, you don't want him getting 1 goal here. You need to get a multiple goal game here along the way. Well, that means he gets 2 here and 2 there, fine. If he gets a hat trick, even better. But for Ovechkin, I still think he's going to do it by the time we get to the end of the year. 15 games, there's still plenty of games to go, but you have to avoid those long droughts. If he goes a game, 2, maybe 3 games at the most, that's fine. But if it starts to stretch to 4, 5, 6, and like I talked about on Thursday's podcast, now that he's at single digits, is there that much more pressure? Is he going to be gripping the stick a little bit more, knowing that time is still on his side, but all it takes for him to not get a goal here, goal there, he's now 3 games, 4 games, and where the pressure is really going to mount, that's where we're going to really see this goal-scoring achievement really be in jeopardy as far as him getting it this year. And I'm sure for the National Hockey League, for the hockey fan, the sports fan, I would think they want to see him get it this year, not next year. So that's what we're going to look at here. But the NHL overall, that is what I have. There isn't really anything else to get into. I know Edmonton won 2 out of 3 on this East Coast trip. They lost to the Devils, but they won in overtime against the Islanders on Friday, and then they beat the Rangers there yesterday at the Garden. As Edmonton is trying to stave off a LA King team that is on a bit of a streak. They've won 5 in a row, and they've really played well. And like I mentioned, 1 point behind the Edmonton Oilers for second place. And for first place, if they were to meet up in the playoffs for home ice. And remember, I believe they played each other in the first round last year, so that would be a rematch of last year's first round. And then both of those teams are 4 and 5 points behind the Vegas Golden Knights in the Pacific, so just keep that in mind. But when it comes to the rest of the league, Panthers still have a 4-point lead over both Tampa and Toronto. Toronto's lost a couple games in a row, where Tampa now dead even in the Atlantic. Capitals, as we all know, they're out in front, but Carolina's played well, winners of 7 straight, and now have a, 8-point lead over the Devils, so they should be fine. Well, they will be fine. They'll host the Devils there in the first round, unless the Rangers catch them, who are currently now 6 points behind. Sizable lead, but not sizable enough considering they still have about 14 games to go here in the regular season. But now the Rangers have taken the second spot in the Eastern Conference when it comes to the wild card. And then Ottawa, who's also been on a bit of a hot streak, winning 6 in a row. They currently have just 5 points over the Rangers. Rangers are now 1 point over the Canadiens. The Blue Jackets, who had that winning streak in their own right a couple of weeks ago, now have lost 3 straight. But 1 point over Montreal, who's played well here. 2 points over both Columbus and the Detroit Red Wings. 4 points over the Islanders and Bruins. And then 6 points over the Penguins. And I'll leave it there. I know the Flyers are 8 points back. But that's what you have going there in the East. And then in the West, Winnipeg, where Dallas and Colorado, like I mentioned. Colorado's now 2 points behind the Dallas Stars. And they are 6 points ahead of the Wild. So now the Wild looks like they're going to be entrenched in the 1 spot of the wild card there out west. But Colorado's looking to see if they can get home ice against the Stars. And if they were to get second place in the Central Division, they will do that. So that's going to be a fight to the finish between those 2 squads. And we talked about what's happening out in the Pacific. Wild 6 points ahead of the Canucks right now in the wild card race, where the Canucks are tied with St. Louis. But because they have a game in hand, even though St. Louis has 2 more wins, but the Canucks have the second seed as of right this moment. Then you have Calgary and the Utah Hockey Club, 2 points behind them, each with 71 points. We'll see how that goes down the stretch with those teams. So you have really, in essence, 4 teams fighting for 1 spot out west. And in the East, you have, I'll say, 6 teams fighting for 1 spot. I won't include the Islanders or the Flyers right now because, I won't include the Penguins and Flyers at the current moment. I have to put in the Islanders, only 4 points back. And not only that, but they also have 2 games in hand on the Rangers, and I believe they still have another matchup with the Rangers too on top of all that. So just keep that in mind. But Rangers, Canadians, Jackets, Wings, Islanders, Bruins, 6 teams for 1 spot there in the East. So that's going to really be a fight to the finish there in the National Hockey League. And with the schedule this coming week, tonight, Buffalo at Boston, only because the Bruins are in the mix. Philly at Tampa, Jersey at Columbus, Calgary at Toronto, Kings in Minnesota. Then you have Ottawa, Montreal, big game there. Calgary, the New York Rangers, Islanders in Pittsburgh. That's a huge game for the Penguins. Detroit at Washington, Anaheim at Dallas, Utah, Edmonton, Winnipeg at Vancouver. And then Wednesday, just 2 games, Colorado at Toronto, Seattle, Minnesota, before you get to Thursday, the weekend, etc. So that's what you have there with the National Hockey League. Now, let me turn my attention to baseball before I get to football and wrap up here as I get in the batter's box. I have to start here, people. In essence, opening day begins tomorrow. Probably when your alarm goes off, because you have a 2-game stretch here tomorrow and Wednesday, 6 a.m. Tokyo. I believe the games are on ESPN, where the Cubs and Dodgers will face one another. Of course, they'll flip-flop who the home teams are over the next 2 days. And the Dodgers, the reason why I bring them up is because for everything that has happened from the time dating back to even last offseason, bringing in Shohei Ohtani, then winning an MVP this past year, bringing in Yoshinobu Yamamoto, having a solid season, although he missed a big part of it, but then contributed in the postseason, in particular at Game 5 against San Diego, which they had to win, and they did so by moving on to a divisional series, and then what he did even in the World Series, the Game 2 against the Yankees, and in between, of course. Then you had them win a World Series, and how I teased how it was going to be World Series sweep or bust for this team, considering the expectations, 162 games, etc., and they almost had a sweep, considering they're up 3-0 to the Yanks, and they won in 5. And then this past offseason, when they signed Tanner Scott, when they signed Blake Snell, when they signed Roki Sasaki, when they re-signed Teoscar Hernandez, when they re-signed Kike Hernandez, and brought back not only pretty much the same team, but more added arsenal to an already loaded team. So now, here's the premise for a Dodger team that's going to start their defense of their World Series title from last year. Can they go 162-0 and 11-0 in the playoffs to be the first team in Major League Baseball history to go 173-0? Of course, I'm kidding, people. There's no way they're going to do that. But, hey, we can have some fun. How about this? How about going 11-0 in the postseason? That would be something. I mean, they almost had a World Series sweep last year. And considering with all their resources and all of their procurements of this offseason and last offseason, and to think they're not going to have Mookie Betts in the lineup over the first 2 games because of an illness that he's had for, it seems to be almost a week now, to the point where he's actually lost 15 pounds. And when you watch Mookie Betts, obviously he's in great shape. He's thin as a rail to begin with. I understand he's got some muscle packed underneath, but to think he's lost 15 pounds, so obviously with him being dehydrated and not being 100%, trying to just put as many fluids in him to get him back. And I would think that he's with the team in Japan, but at the same time, I'm sure he's going to suit up but not participate, as I mentioned. But this team, as we all know, is loaded. And I'm not going to give you a bit of a preview here as far as their season goes, but we know for them, it is going to be another World Series, I'll say sweep, for the hell of it, or bust. Or maybe even 11-0 or go 11-3 or whatever it is in the postseason. And as it was, last year they went 11-5. They lost 2 games to the Padres, they lost 2 games to the Mets, and 1 game to the Yanks. So I would think, even with all of the reinforcements and all of the additions that they've had throughout the winter, and now as we head into opening day for them tomorrow, I would think that maybe 11-3, 11-2, 11-1 this upcoming postseason, or dare I say a complete sweep in the division series, LCS and World Series. Is that too much to ask for? For a team that has a payroll that is about $379, or I think it's $392 million. And if you include the deferred money, it's well over $500 million. So what do you think? Could they do it? Could they go 11-0? Obviously, we have to wait till October, so don't hold your breath. But other baseball news and notes real quick. The Yankees, how bad their rotation has just been this whole spring training. Whether it's Luis Hill with that lat strain, he's going to be out for a few months. We know about Garrett Cole, done for the year and part of next year with the Tommy John surgery that he had there last Tuesday. And now Clarke Schmidt is going to miss his start today against the Blue Jays, where he's going to have a bullpen session, but he has shoulder soreness. Hopefully it's nothing that's in the ligament or nothing that could really be alarming to the point where they may have to shut him down for some time. So the bullpen session is going to be huge for Clarke Schmidt because that means they'll have 3/5 of their rotation out for the start of the year, and their starter for an opening day against the Milwaukee Brewers is going to be Carlos Rodon, which I know is maybe not the fan favorite of the Bronx Bombers, but you got to go with what you have. And let's see what they're going to do to piecemeal this together when they get to opening day, especially if Schmidt's not going to be a part of this rotation. So something that you're going to have to keep in mind here as we get closer, just 10 days away from the, in essence, actual start of the baseball season. And speaking of starting pitchers, guess who's going to be your opening day starter for my beloved New York Mets? Kodai Senga? No, it's not him. Dave Peterson? Think again. It can't be Tyler McGill. Frankie Montas is hurt, right? Yes, he is. So who does that leave us with? None other than Clay Holmes. Can you believe that, people? Now listen, he's had a killer spring. 9 2/3 innings. He's struck out 13 batters, walked 4. He's given up 2 hits, and more importantly, 0 runs. But it's exhibition, people. He may have done that against the Marlins. He may have done that against the Cardinals. He may have done that maybe even against the Astros. And I understand the Astros, they have a semblance of a team. Where the Cardinals, they could be in last place in the Central Division. The Marlins are the Marlins. Do I even need to say any more? So I don't know who he's pitched against. But to me, hopefully that could translate to opening day in Houston. Which if he has faced them, and considering Houston right down in West Palm Beach from where the Mets play in Port St. Lucie. So who knows? Do I have high hopes for Clay Holmes this year? Can I look at what he's done here so far this spring and think that, he's going to be the guy that's going to carry us throughout the course of 162 games with 33 starts and pitch well? Now, considering what happened last year with Jeremy Hefner, the pitching coach, and the magic dust that was sprinkled over Luis Severino and Jose Quintana and Sean Manaea to where they brought back Manaea, 3 years, $75 million, could the same be said for Clay Holmes? One could only hope in Metville that will be the case. So we'll have to wait and see there. And then you have Lucas Giolito has to start. Shocker. His season on the IL. Red Sox pitcher was out all of last year, if you recall. He has a hamstring issue, so we'll have to monitor that, especially to my guy JD, the Red Sox fan. And then you have Joey Gallo. What is this with position players or former position players that are now looking to become pitchers, whether that be a starter or reliever? Last week, I talked about Tyler Naquin, who is in Guardian camp, the former Indian/Guardian, also played for the Mets there for a time a couple of years ago. But he's looking to transition to become a pitcher. And now Joey Gallo. Think about this. Here's a guy, when he came up as a Texas Ranger, the slugger that he was, a lot of people thought this guy was going to be a big-time Major League player. And mind you, he's put up some big-time numbers, albeit along the likes of the Rob Deers and the Adam Dunns of the world. Look them up. But for Joey Gallo, who is a lifetime, get ready for this, 194 hitter, strikes out in the bunches. Yes, he has hit some long home runs throughout his career. But now he was a member coming into this spring training of the Chicago White Sox. Even the White Sox cut him. A team that won 41 games and lost the most games in Major League Baseball history in a regular season. And could be even worse this year than last year. Even the White Sox said, you know what? Sorry, Mr. Gallo, we got to give you a pink slip. But now he wants to try pitching. Hey, who am I to say he's going to be unsuccessful? Or who am I to say that either he or Naquin, they're not going to try or not maybe latch on to a Major League roster? Rick Hankiel had some success. But that was the other way around. Now I got to reel that in, JAYREELZ. Ankiel was a starter there in St. Louis, then he became a position player, most notably out in center field, where he actually had a cup of coffee with the Mets, I believe in 2010, 2011, around that early era of Citi Field and some forgettable years with the Mets. So good luck to Naquin, good luck to Gallo. Let's see what happens here, but Joey Gallo, I'm just going to end it there. And then lastly, this ballpark issue with the Rays. I'm just throwing this out there just for the hell of it, only because Stu Sternberg, the owner, now they're not going to play in Tropicana Field, as you know. They're playing at Steinbrenner Field. It's going to be a long, rough year for them. But for the following 3 years, although the roof will be fixed, the local authorities were hoping that maybe a ballpark could be built next to Tropicana Field, where the vote had to be by March 31st. But now Stu Sternberg has come out and said that he's not going to be able to have enough public funds in order for him to finance this stadium. So therefore, they'll play the last 3 years in the Tropicana Field starting in 2026. But then after that, that's it. So it looks like Tampa is going to be on their way out, which is a shame because they have put up some decent teams here over the last half dozen years. They made it to a World Series in 2020. They made it to the playoffs more than a handful of times. And last year was the first year where they did not make it or qualify into the postseason. And who knows what their year is going to be like this year, considering they're playing the bulk of their home games in April, May, and early June. And then 69 of their final 103 games are going to be on the road because there's going to be multiple rain delays and possible rainouts when you get to the middle of June, July, August. In Florida, as you all know, you're going to have a guaranteed deluge every afternoon. But that is just a sad situation, knowing that the financial delays and knowing that they're not going to have enough to cost from the public money to finance the stadium is just an absolute joke. And I get it. They're Tampa. They're not a big market. And they're not an organization that just has money coming out of their ears. But still, just a shame to see that happen there. So the local government, although had the approval of bonds and meeting specific conditions to gain public financing, etc., but Stu Sternberg said that is not the case. It's going to be overruns. It's going to be something that we don't want to deal with. So therefore, we're out after those 3 years. Now, can anything happen between now and maybe the start of next year where they can maybe break some ground to build a stadium, let's say from the start of 2026 to the end of 2028, and then in 2029 they'll have a team? Who knows? But right now it's looking like Tampa's going to find another location there when you get to the 2029 season, which is just disgraceful because you already have Oakland leaving to go to Sacramento. You have Tampa and their issues. The Marlins, they've been a disaster. Baseball can't get out of their own way when it comes to these teams at times. All right, and now let me wrap up here with the NFL as I got some news and notes, some signings, things of that nature as I put on the helmet and shoulder pads. And we would think that after this last flurry, free agency and teams that are looking for players is probably going to quiet down quite a bit until we get to the latter part of April, where all of the pomp and circumstance of the NFL draft and everything's going to be ratcheted up as far as who's moving up draft boards, players that could be traded, things of that nature. But the Bengals get their men in record-setting fashion. So the Bengals, who are historically and notoriously cheap, and the GM put his money where his mouth is for both Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Both of those guys coming back, where Chase got a record deal, more so than Myles Garrett, as he's making $40.2 million, 4 years, $161 million, where I believe 115 of that is guaranteed. Highest annual value NFL history for a non-quarterback. So not only does Chase get the bag, but his teammate T. Higgins gets the bag. 4 years, $115 million. And the first 2 years, I believe I don't know what the guaranteed money is off the top of my head, but the first 2 years guaranteed. So those wideouts to go along with Joe Burrow, and I believe Burrow also, not deferred, had reworked his contract. As you know, he got a big contract there a couple of years ago. But you have those two weapons there in Cincinnati, which they needed in the worst way. Now, they're not going to have Trey Hendrickson, as you know. He's looking to request a trade, and I believe the Bengal front office has said, all right, well, that's what you're going to do, fine. Because when you have three players quarterback and 2 wide receivers, with all that money tied in, it's going to be tough to dole out a lot of other money unless guys are going to rework contracts similar to what Burrow had to do to get Chase on board as well as T. Higgins. So that's going to be a threat there in the AFC North and the AFC overall. Let's see if that's going to pay dividends for a team that has not made the playoffs in the last 2 years. Granted that they have had winning records over the last 2 years. On top of the 2 years where they went to the AFC Championship in back-to-back years and making it to a Super Bowl now 4 years ago. So you have that. Cooper Kupp signs with the Seattle Seahawks, which he goes right up the coast. The Seahawks, of course, playing in the same division as the Rams. And the Seahawks also bring in DeMarcus Lawrence from the Cowboys, the pass rusher. And we know that the Seahawks have revamped their offense in particular with DK Metcalf in Pittsburgh and Geno Smith in Las Vegas. So now they're starting to add some players here. And you had a war of words, or a war of tweets in this case, between DeMarcus Lawrence and Micah Parsons, to where DeMarcus Lawrence had made some comments saying that, hey, I'm in now Seattle, getting out of Dallas. I do thank Dallas, but I have a better chance of making it to the Super Bowl there. And then Micah Parsons came out and said, oh yeah, you want to leave? And whatever was said, but there's been a back and forth between those two. And Micah Parsons looking to secure his bag. But Parsons is another guy who's been compared to Lawrence Taylor, which of course, you got to take that with a grain of salt. But it's not as if Micah Parsons has flourished in big games against big-time opponents, especially in playoff scenarios. So who knows where that's going to lead. We all know that that's going to be bulletin board and trash talk, whatever, between two now former teammates. So whatever you want to take from that, that's up to you. Cooper Rush signs a 2-year deal with the Ravens as a backup. That's a very good deal there. So now you would think Trey Lance is going to be your backup there in Dallas. So let's see how that turns out, especially if Dak Prescott, who's had his history with injuries last year and a few years back when he broke his ankle, when you had, I believe of all people, was it Garrett Gilbert was the backup that 1 year, I believe it was in 2020. Then Kyle Juszczyk comes back on a 2-year deal with San Francisco. We know San Francisco's done a big-time purge. Jordan Mason, the guy who rushed for over 100 yards against the Jets in the opening night game in San Francisco, gets traded to Minnesota to go along with Aaron Jones. So you got a pretty decent backfield with those two guys. And then you had Kirk Cousins is going to stay in Atlanta for now, or so it looks like. Cheaper to keep him there as opposed to trying to maybe consider a trade or cutting him, because you're going to cost a lot on your cap and dead cap on top of that. So he's going to be a Falcon for now. We'll have to wait and see as we get deeper into the new season here with the NFL. And then you had Juju Smith-Schuster stay in Kansas City. Gardner Minshew, a decent backup there in Kansas City. So I guess they said goodbye to one Carson Wentz. And now Mason Rudolph is back in Pittsburgh after a year in Tennessee on a 2-year deal. But as I conclude, is he going to be the guy that's going to throw to DK Metcalf and George Pickens for big-time receptions and big-time playmaking ability here in 2025? I know Russell Wilson is still out there. I know Aaron Rodgers is still out there. Is that the direction that they're going to go here in Pittsburgh? I hold my breath, and with bated breath, to wait and see who's going to be under center to throw the ball to those two guys, as well as Pat Freiermuth on top of that, when it comes to a Pittsburgh Steelers season, when it comes to a Pittsburgh Steelers season, let me enunciate here as they battle it out in a very loaded AFC North. That'll do it, my good people. Another episode just about the books. As always, thank you so much for stopping by, carving out precious time out of your day to listen to what it is that I have to say about what goes on in the wonderful world of sports. If you haven't done so, please, people, I implore you to subscribe, like, leave a comment on my YouTube channel at JAYREELZ, or on any podcast platform that you listen to, whether it's Apple, Spotify, any of the other available ones that are out there, and there's a ton of them, as you all know. Please, throw me a few stars, write a review, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember, one more time, I'm an independent podcaster / content creator doing this not only for the love, but doing this for some income, trying to generate passive income. So I need all the support that I could possibly get. Share it with your friends, family, foes, frenemies on social media. Take a screenshot, share it with me. I'll repost it, etc. To the diehard, to the sports kook in your life, to the casual, the good sports fan, or even just the run-of-the-mill person who likes sports. Send it to them, please. I, one more time, ask you to do so. I would sincerely and gratefully appreciate that. And if you want to hit me up with a question, comment, suggestion, you can do so at the following. On YouTube at JAYREELZ, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, the JAYREELZ Podcast, Twitter, JAYREELZ1, just a number, or the old-fashioned way, the JAYREELZ Podcast at gmail.com. I'll be more than happy to follow up with you guys and gals, because whether you do or do not know, this is what I love to do, people. This is why I quit my job to do this full time, to try to blaze a trail and a path in this podcast universe to have my voice be heard as a lifelong diehard kook sports fan who eats, drinks, sleeps, breathes sports. In the blood, in the DNA, as I like to say, talking sports since birth. As long as I'm in front of this microphone and camera, I will continue to deliver nothing but passion, fire, fury, energy with my thoughts, opinions, critiques, praise, analysis, feelings on anything and everything that happens on the the diamond, ice, gridiron, hardwood, golf course, racetrack, tennis court, boxing ring, octagon, you name it. From my lips to your ears, from my heart to your soul, from where I am to wherever you are, the JAYREELZ Podcast always comes correct, direct, and in full effect. From the South Bronx to South Beach to South End to the South Pacific and all points beyond, peace, love, and God bless everybody. And until next time on the JAYREELZ Podcast, on the flip, baby.